Okay, welcome everyone to another episode on the Palestine syllabus for RPA. And this episode is the kind of companion episode to unit number 7 on the syllabus. So we have as our guests today Muhammad Ali Khalidi, the author of the pieces in the unit, of course, and Augie Fowler. So I'll let them introduce themselves.
Yeah, I'm Muhammad Ali Khalidi. I'm a philosophy professor at CUNY at the City University of New York Graduate Center. My main areas are in philosophy of science and philosophy of mind, but I've also written a few pieces on Palestine from a philosophical perspective, and I also do a bit of work on classical Arabic Islamic philosophy.
And I'm Augie Fowler. I'm a philosopher based in Philadelphia at the moment. Technically, also in the data science program here at Bryn Mawr College. And my interests are mostly in metaphysics and philosophy of science, but increasingly in philosophy of social science and political philosophy to some extent. And I'm here to help with this interview today.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, I think I didn't introduce myself, so I'll do it briefly. So my name is Ziad Nabulsi. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy at York University. I work primarily on African philosophy from the standpoint of history and philosophy of science, but I also have interests in political philosophy. So maybe the way we can begin is if Muhammad Ali Khalidi, if you can tell us about how you think of the relationship between philosophy and academic debates on Palestine, as well as political activism in relation to the Palestinian issue.
Yeah, I mean, philosophy as a discipline likes to think of itself as dealing with the universal, with broad generalities, with principles, and not looking so much at specific cases or looking at the particularities of the messy world as we find it. I think that's maybe an oversimplification or misconception, because in every philosophical enterprise, there's a need, I think, to think about things in broad universal terms, but also applying those universal principles to specific cases to see how they play out and how they might need to be modified. And what I'm saying here is just basically a kind of regurgitation of the idea that was first put forward by Nelson Goodman of reflective equilibrium, and then taken up by Rawls, this need to sort of go back and forth between broad principles and their applications to specific cases to see how you modify those principles. And I think Palestine, the question of Palestine, is a very important test case for a lot of our broad moral, political principles. And it's a very interesting case to try and see how those universals play out in specific cases. Unfortunately, I think Palestine has not been theorized very much by philosophers. It's mostly discussed in the social sciences, historians and political scientists and so on. But I think that's very unfortunate. I think there's a lot of room for philosophical thinking, in other words, moral thinking, ethical thinking, normative thinking in general. And I think very often when these topics are broached by researchers in other disciplines who do great work, they're not so much concerned with the moral rights and wrongs. They're not so much concerned with the normative issues. They're more concerned with the descriptive issues, and that's all very valuable. And of course, philosophers in their work have to take into account the work of social scientists, historians, and so on. And so that work is very valuable indeed, but it tends to be a different kind of work, I think.
Right. That's excellent. Augie, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I can speak, I mean, as a sort of an outsider to the, in some senses, to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as someone who's neither Jewish nor has any Arab or Palestinian background, but is American, and so in that sense, of course, complicit in what's going on. as an relative outsider, I can speak from my own experience of being pretty sensitive to moral arguments. So being sensitive to people saying, well, don't like Israelis have a right, or Jewish people have a right to their own nation or self-determination. Like, do they not get that? These are moral arguments or political arguments. And as someone who wants to be, of course, very sensitive to the risk of anti-Semitism, and we're all now aware of how racism, anti-Semitism are often implicit. That I might not have any overt prejudices or explicit biases, but I want to be aware. So, and I think a lot of thoughtful people are very aware of these moral and political considerations, and they're often used as a weapon, right, to hamstring any kind of critical discourse. Like, so these like moral, like the argument for self-determination we're going to get to is, I think, is used as a kind of a weapon to prevent people from thinking too critically about what's going on. So I think that for me, philosophy is an important component to this thinking through these issues, because just on a practical level, I do think a lot of people are thinking in moral terms. They're thinking what they ought to do. They don't want to be guilty of some moral harm or some kind of prejudice, wrongful prejudice. And so thinking through these issues philosophically provides a really important kind of confidence. And I that you think, no, I've thought through these issues. I know what I think. I'm not going to be susceptible to being put down or silenced by what are essentially bad arguments. I mean, it's fascinating the number of bad philosophical moral arguments that are put out in this arena. I would say, yeah, largely in defense of really bad practices, used as a weapon of bad practices on the part of the Israeli government, and yeah, etc. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Yeah, in relation to that, and this is really good because we can segue into the discussion of national self-determination. But before doing that, I mean, it occurred to me that there is also another question of and I guess this is directly addressed to Muhammad Ali Khalidi, which is the question of how is this kind of philosophical work received by academics who work on Palestine from different disciplinary angles, especially because it might seem that for a lot of people, well, they do have normative assumptions that they take up, but perhaps they're not defended explicitly, and it often seems that philosophy approaches certain issues, or almost all issues, as open questions, right? So there's a question of, can the systematic violent displacement of Palestinians be justified? I mean, that could be the topic of a philosophical discussion. And in my limited experience, if you talk to, anthropologists or social historians who have a specific political orientation, they might be taken aback a little bit by this approach, which seems to make everything open to questions. So I was wondering if we could say a little bit about that, maybe from experience, or maybe we don't have to personalize it. We can keep it maybe more.
No, I mean, I think you're right. There isn't very much uptake by people in other disciplines of philosophical work of this kind, philosophical work on the question of Palestine, or other types of philosophical work. And I think there may be two sources of anxiety. One is the one that you alluded to, which is we start from first principles. There's these open questions. We talk in these broad universal terms. And a lot of social scientists, I think, are uneasy with that. They want to talk about specific cases. They want to keep it real, as it were. But the other thing is, I think there's an anxiety sometimes over just normative thinking in general. Oh, are you saying that there's this absolute truth, or are you talking about things that are completely sort of decontextualized? And I think the response to that is, look, we think that there is a difference between right and wrong. There are things that are just and other things that are unjust. And I think a lot of social scientists do assume this kind of thing in their own work. And so, without saying that these moral truths transcend all time and space, I think what we're trying to figure out is, what is justice? What is the just thing to do? What is the morally right decision to make in these kinds of cases? And so I think there's, these two sources of anxiety are a little misplaced. And I think maybe some social theorists and social scientists should become a bit more comfortable with philosophical work on these topics.
Good, good. Augie, do you want to jump in? Any thoughts on this issue?
No, I don't. No, that's great. I don't have anything to add.
Okay, okay. If that's the case, I think we can kind of jump into the substantive issue. So, for the syllabus, we've picked two pieces by Muhammad Ali Khalidi. So the first piece is a book chapter on formulating the right of national self-determination, and I just wanted to ask, how did you approach this question as a philosopher? Because it gets invoked a lot. And actually, I mean, there is an interesting example from maybe a book which is very much concerned with descriptive empirical claims. I'm thinking of Chomsky's The Fateful Triangle, which we talked a bit with Augie about in the previous conversation. And it's very interesting that Chomsky, there are parts of the book where Chomsky takes it for granted that Jewish settlers in a British Mandate Palestine had the national right to self-determination on that territory. And so he sees the problem is that the national right to self-determination by the Palestinian inhabitants was not taken into account. But he takes it for granted that in the Mandate period, there was a national right for self-determination in the territory of Mandate Palestine for the Jewish settlers. So I found this chapter really interesting in this regard because, like we said, it puts a question mark in relation to that issue. So maybe we can just begin by talking about how you approach the concept of national self-determination, which is discussed by philosophers, but also frequently invoked by political theorists.
Yeah, I mean, first, look, thanks for doing me the honor of putting these two papers on the syllabus. And these are papers that I wrote quite a long time ago, maybe longer ago than I'd like to admit, more than 2 decades ago. But I largely stand by what I said in those two papers. I might emphasize things a little differently or phrase things a little differently. In particular, I think I would prefer now to talk not so much of the right of national self-determination, because that's not a very neutral way of describing the right, but rather the right of political self-determination. And I think I was just following some other theorists who refer to it as the right of national self-determination. And basically, the right of political self-determination is the right of self-government. Who has the right to govern themselves where? Who has the right to decide which territories become states? Who has the right to decide where the borders should be drawn in the world? That's basically the content of the right. And I think a lot of theorists have said that that right primarily belongs to nations, national groups, ethnic groups, groups that are homogeneous in terms of their culture. And part of what I was trying to do in that paper is to argue against that philosophically, and to say that there's no reason to think that if we start from these kind of universal moral ideas or principles, that right should go primarily to groups that are culturally homogeneous. And there's a couple of reasons, and here I'm following others as well. And I want to give a shout out to the late Thomas Capitan, who was the editor of the volume in which my paper appeared, who I really benefited from discussions with him and from his writings on this issue. But a couple of points that he makes is that, look, and other people have made this point as well, the world as we know it is not divided into these homogeneous groups. Typically, people who have a certain culture or united by a certain ethnicity are intermingled with others. And so if you give that right primarily to nations or to cultural groups, the question is, what happens to others living amongst them? Do they have to go elsewhere? Are they relegated to some kind of second-class status? Do they not fully participate in the process of self-government? The other thing is nationalism is a very potent force and can easily turn into chauvinism and can easily turn into belligerence towards other groups, to members of outgroups. And by giving this right primarily to nations, you encourage some of those kinds of atavistic tendencies, those kinds of chauvinist, behaviors. And so there's sort of a potential danger. And it just seems to go against a general democratic voluntarist outlook to say that nations, culturally homogeneous groups, are privileged in this regard. So what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is to say something like, look, whenever a group in some region of the world wants, where there's a substantial majority, where there's a clear majority that wants to govern itself, to constitute itself as a state, to secede from a current state, to merge with another existing state, that group should have the right. So that sounds reasonable and simple and so on. But one thing that arises, there are a couple of problems with this. One problem is, what do you do about competing majorities? So you have these regions of the world, maybe where a substantial majority, and by the way, I say substantial majority because this is a fateful decision. So we probably don't want it decided by a bare majority of 50%, but it can't be unanimous because given the way of the world, you never have 100% on anything. And so the idea is you need something like a supermajority, which in many constitutions in many states is needed for fateful decisions. So 2/3 or 3/4 or something like that. The threshold is a little arbitrary, but the point is that it shouldn't just be a bare majority. So the two problems are, one problem is what do you do when you have these competing majorities? So some population in A, substantial majority wants to constitute that as a separate state, as an independent, self-governing region. But then there's a region within it where there's a substantial majority that wants to be a state, right? And so who do you give priority to? Do you say that the region A as a whole or this sub-region B should take priority? And I try and argue in this paper, and I think this is something that hadn't really been argued before, that you should always give priority to the smallest region in which there's a substantial majority which wants to self-govern. So that way, you're not completely ignoring the desires of any population, while at least partly satisfying the desires of every population. Because even though the people in A might not be completely happy that B is going to be its own independent state, at least their desire can be partly satisfied because the remaining region A minus B is going to also get the right to self-govern. So that was one of the things that I was trying to argue in this paper. The other thing is, of course, the question that remains is, what about territory? Like, how do we know that the group that says it wants to self-govern in this region really has the right to the territory? Because given the world as we know it, I mean, if we lived in cyberspace or in the Matrix or something, there wouldn't be need to assert a right to territory. But self-government doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens on Earth. It happens on land. And so we need to know who has the right to which land. And here I think the presumption is in favor of whatever population has resided. So, you might say whoever owns the land, but it's not just a matter of private property ownership, right? There are many people who don't own property, but who have lived, they're descendants of people who've lived on a land for generations and generations. And so there's a kind of presumption in favor of prolonged occupancy, whoever's been on that land for a long time, right? The problem, though, with that is sometimes, even though they've been on that land for a long time, maybe they forced other people off that land. And so we need to know, does anyone else have a claim? Has anyone else have a live kind of claim to the land? So in this paper also, I talk about how do we adjudicate these kinds of claims. And the basic conclusion is that, when it comes to claims that are, lost in the mists of time, thousands of years ago, whatever, you can't really give that much credence to those claims because there's too much ambiguity about who is really living there. Is the current population actually the descendants? Do you transfer rights to occupancy over many, many generations, over hundreds of years? But if there's a recent displacement or someone has just been forced out, well, then you have to give those people some, ability to either go back or give them some kind of compensation or restitution. So that's sort of the basic sort of moral or perspective that I have on this. That it's interesting that you said that Chomsky thought that it was pretty uncontroversial. I actually didn't remember that aspect of the Fateful Triangle, that Jewish people had the right to self-determination in the land of Palestine in 1948. I think, and I argue for this in the paper, that there is no real valid claim to Jewish self-determination in any substantial part of the land of Palestine. The Jews had just recently immigrated there, the vast majority. Of course, there was an indigenous Jewish population in Palestine. But before the rise of Zionism, they didn't think of themselves as an independent people. There was no real demand for self-determination. But the Jews who emigrated to Palestine starting in the late 19th century hadn't been there for a prolonged period of time. In 1948, they owned about 6% of the land. There were maybe small areas around the city of Tel Aviv, what later became the city of Tel Aviv, where maybe there was a Jewish majority, where they could have some kind of claim to self-government in those areas. But it was certainly far, far short of what the United Nations decided in 1947, which is to give the majority of the land of Palestine to the Jewish population, which are at the time a minority and really were only in possession of a very small portion of the land. So I don't think that there was any legitimate claim to self-determination by Jewish people in the land of Palestine in 1948. However, I think the situation now is quite different. The situation when I was writing this article, but also now, because now you have prolonged occupancy. There are people who've been there for generations. There's no question of them, going anywhere else. And I think that now we have to, I think they have a legitimate claim to self-determination, provided there is restitution for those who were forced out, who were ethnically cleansed from the land in 1947-48, which is the majority of the indigenous population that had been living there for millennia. And there we have to figure out now a way of sharing. And I think there's no one solution that the right of self-determination gives. It really depends. Depends on the choices and the decisions of the people living there. So if a substantial majority want the whole territory to be one state and they share in that, that's one thing. Another possibility is that there are majorities in different regions that want their own independence. And so it could be divided, partitioned in some way. Maybe it could be partitioned into confederations or cantons or different regions that are united in some confederation or something like that. But anyway, I think this voluntarist principle allows for different ways of dividing it up, provided some restitution is made for people who have been forced out of the land, and provided that majorities within different subregions are allowed to govern themselves, either as independent states or perhaps as self-governing regions within a confederation or something like that.
Okay, thank you very much for the overview and the exposition of the paper. Augie, do you want to pose any follow-up questions or comments?
Yeah, I have a kind of a general follow-up question. So it seemed so yeah, so from my impression of sort of what broadly the modern liberal tradition, um, there's I always thought there was some tension between on one hand saying um, that a cultural group has a sort of right to self-determination that allows them to form a political unit in which they're the majority, and the kind of broader Enlightenment liberal principles that maybe include something like that the kind of the basic political unit is the individual, and that the government's role is something like adjudicating differences between individuals, and that most that something like religion or ethnicity, at least in a kind of a really rosy picture of this of this political tradition, because of course it didn't play out this way. Like these are sort of morally arbitrary distinctions. Now I don't know if they are really morally arbitrary, but just to maybe pose an example, like suppose like right-handed people decided that they wanted to form a government, and they are the substantial majority, and they decide we're going to be a right-handed nation where where yeah right what would you call it the nation, the right-handed nation or something, and they meet all these criteria and they form their nation. It seems arbitrary and odd. Like we wouldn't think that. I mean, I would hope that maybe it's too rarefied of a thought experiment. But then you think, well, but no, cultural groups, ethnic groups are not like that. They have rich traditions, and they have relationships with each other that are morally valuable. And so these things are more, so it's different. It's different than a right-handed nation. But I would have thought that, like in the liberal tradition, you'd say, well, it's not really the role of the government to make those kinds of, or like of a political formation to make those distinctions between, well, the right-handed thing's not a morally valuable distinction, but tradition and cultural affiliation is. So I'm thinking kind of broad strokes here, but it also struck me as kind of odd that a group, like an ethnic group, could claim that they have a right to be the majority, for example, or that they can form a political group that is the majority. And for example, in the smallest, in the principle you gave of the smallest substantial majority that doesn't contain another smaller group. So I'm just curious if you could comment on that, if it's kind of a misreading of what we might call the liberal tradition, that these aren't really the kinds of distinctions that should be drawn in the formation of a state. Because it seems like the authors you're working with are definitely like taking for granted that a cultural group can be the appropriate group to kind of draw the circle around of, like, this is the political formation that the state with its coercive powers, etc., are going to be drawn around. Does that make sense?
No,
This is kind of a vague thought, but
no, I think there is a tension, and I think I think some political philosophers have tried to bend over backwards to resolve that tension without too much success. So there's an Israeli philosopher, Yael Tamir, who wrote a book called Liberal Nationalism, where she tried to say that nationalist principles could be made compatible with basic liberal democratic ideals, but I don't think it works. I think, I mean, I don't think we have time to go into the full argument, but I do touch on it in the paper a little bit. And at that point, I think her book hadn't been published, if I'm not mistaken, but she'd published papers on this. The others who try and make a kind of half-hearted defense of giving certain status to cultural groups within a kind of democratic liberal framework are two philosophers, Avishai Margalit and Joseph Raz, and they wrote a paper which I discuss in my paper too. And I think they try and argue that even though it goes against liberal democratic principles to privilege a certain nation or a cultural group in giving them the right to self-determination, that often cultures are not secure unless they're given states. So it would be good to secure the persistence of a culture, the survival of a culture by making the state somehow reflect that culture. And I just don't buy the argument. I think there are a lot of multicultural states where there's a kind of liberal democratic government that is neutral among different cultural or ethnic affinities or identities, and yet protects each of those ethnic, cultural, linguistic identities. So I think you can have a democratic liberal state, maybe a binational state, or just a completely neutral state, which at the same time is protective of the different ethnicities and cultures and so on that live. And we've got examples of that. So I think there's really no good liberal democratic argument for privileging nations in this way when it comes to self-government.
Yeah, and just on that, I think, yeah, I mean, I think the tension that Augie pointed out is quite interesting because, I mean, my understanding of, and maybe we'll get to this when we talk about Theodor Herzl and the piece on Herzl, but my understanding also of at least some of the early Zionist writers is their response was, well, we try to embrace this kind of liberal political orientation. We try to assimilate, not attribute any significance to culture or ethnicity, but we were marked out. And of course, people talk about this in relation to the Weimar Republic, where you got a lot of Jewish assimilation and so on. But then, of course, we know what happened later. So in a sense, it seems to be partially a response to what people have taken to be the failures of liberalism to defend minorities that were marked out in Western and Central and Eastern Europe.
Oh, sure. I think that's fine as a diagnosis of what happened in Europe, and I think Herzl kind of typifies that kind of attitude. But I don't think that is right when it comes to what happened in Palestine. So the Zionist movement, as I understand it, never, in its vast majority, did not argue for the integration of a Jewish component into an existing population in Palestine. The aim of the Zionist movement was really always to transform Palestine into a Jewish state. So it was not just to find a safe haven for Jews. And the opposition to Zionism, as I understand it, from the indigenous population was not primarily a reaction against immigration or a racist or a chauvinist kind of reaction. It was a reaction to the idea that the Zionist movement wanted to transform Palestine into a Jewish state. So I think if culture, so sometimes a distinction is made between political Zionism and cultural Zionism. So cultural Zionists, people like Asher Ginsberg, Ahad Ha'am was his pseudonym, his literary name. He argued that Jews should go back in maybe small numbers to Palestine to set up communities where they would practice their Judaism, but not transform Palestine into a Jewish state or change its whole character and do away in some way or another with the existing population. But that strand of Zionism was always a tiny minority, and it very early on lost out to political Zionism. So, I mean, I think it is true that many Zionists in Europe were motivated by the fact that Jews in Europe, many of them were assimilated. They were very much willing to participate in the liberal democratic societies in which they found themselves, but they were ostracized, and they experienced anti-Semitism, and they experienced racism. And I think there was this kind of response, well, maybe we should separate. Now, I don't think separatism is the right response. I think the right response to racism should generally be for us to work together to try and do away with racism, to educate people, and to take all kinds of measures to try and make sure that racism doesn't rear its ugly head in our societies. But even if you say that that was not a successful strategy, and that the response of the Zionists was understandable to separate, well, you don't separate at the expense of another people by oppressing another people. If there were a part of the world where they could have separated and set up independent political entity, perhaps that would have been fine if they had claim to the territory. But the solution certainly wasn't to go to a part of the world that was already inhabited, where they didn't have a claim to the territory, and to try and either expel or otherwise get rid of the existing population, or to confine them to some kind of permanent state of disenfranchisement, which is basically what's happened today. So the Zionist movement has either exterminated, expelled, or disenfranchised the existing population of Palestine.
Yes, thank you. And I think clarifying this point and the relationship between that and anti-Semitism in Europe is very important. Augie, do you have any follow-up questions on this point or comments?
I mean, just to kind of point to some interesting I think, to me, there's a interesting connection here to as Ziad pointed out, the kind of the failures of the liberal European societies to protect this minority, and then the reaction to that. And I think my understanding is that one reaction was separatist, nationalist, which also shows up in the Black radical tradition in the United States of separatism, that Black nationalism. But then one other trend right was the kind of communist, anti-Zionist, to say, well, a certain kind of liberalism, this capitalist European liberal societies failed to protect from a trend toward fascism, and so maybe we need to address this other tradition that says address those those conditions that led to the fascist regimes that were able to commit such atrocities. So, and then in the United States, I think there's also the kind of, there's the more maybe people like MLK, or maybe a little more in the liberal tradition, but then there are the Black radical figures who weren't trying to leave, but they were trying to transform society. So maybe like Fred Hampton and the Black Panther Party is explicitly including a lot of others in their movement, not being separatist, but trying to adjust the conditions that gave rise to the scapegoating of minorities, etc. So, and I think my understanding maybe too is, and I'm not an expert on this, but in the Palestinian radical tradition, there's this mix too of leftist Palestinian radicals, maybe who sought to they maybe want to unify the state for the purpose of addressing the. I'm thinking of like Kanafani, maybe as someone who thinks, the left really should be organizing around the exploitation of the working class, which includes the Jewish working class in Palestine. And the Jewish, as a matter of historical fact, the Jewish working class in Palestine didn't do that very well. They organized around Jewish labor exclusively, and so that led to the left not being very successful in.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the mainstream socialist left, but I mean, I think the communists are still, I mean, there is a communist party in Israel, and it's a Jewish Arab party, and it's very much an internationalist kind of approach, and solidarity among the working class is a core principle of theirs. So I think that, yeah, sort of the mainstream supposed socialist leftist majority within Zionism did not. But there's a very interesting book by Ze'ev Sternhell, who is an Israeli social theorist and political theorist, who makes the case that the Zionist movement, even though the majority of it considered itself socialist, really their ideology was really not socialism, but something like a social nationalism. So nationalism was really always first and foremost over and above socialist principles, which would have united the working classes, the Jewish and the Arab Palestinian working classes. And he makes a very, very convincing case that really, even though the mainstream Zionism considered, this is before. Now, of course, I think the right is really much more in control of the Zionist movement, but the Zionist movement tended to be more leftist before around the 1980s. But he makes the case that they professed a kind of socialist ideology, but really their ideology was first and foremost nationalism and a kind of a social nationalism. And he makes a very convincing case for that. So, I mean, just to go back to something you said about separatism, I think I'm not an expert on Black radicalism, but there was a strand of separatism within the African American political movements, even going back to the 19th century. But Marcus Garvey, for instance, had advocated a kind of back to Africa movement. And I think that those kinds of movements have not been very successful. I mean, Zionism has been extraordinarily successful, but I don't think that that's the right solution, because as we're seeing daily, you're just creating more problems with this kind of chauvinist attitude of some kind of exclusivity or separating out different ethnicities or making sure that a state is ethnically pure. And I think it just generates more problems than it solves.
Right, and just maybe as a kind of brief response or comment in relation to this point. I mean, somebody was very, of course, influential in the Pan-Africanist movement and was very interested in the history of Zionism. And the movement was Edward Blyden, who was actually following the development of the Zionist movement in the 19th century. And to this point of return to Africa and the kind of problems it raised, well, of course, Liberia is a very interesting case, right? Because you do get African Americans who move in, but of course, there is a population living on the land. This population gets dispossessed, disenfranchised, was actually explicitly disenfranchised in the first constitution of Liberia. So again, you get this really, interesting parallel. But of course, the big difference is Liberia, I mean, and the Liberian settlers were not backed militarily and economically in the same way that Jewish settlers in Palestine were. So that's, I think, an interesting difference, of course. I mean, one challenge or, question with, that's kind of a friendly challenge to the accountant offered in the chapter. So turning back to the kind of temporal framework that we work with to establish territorial rights, I was thinking that somebody could say, well, isn't that just a way to, despite the intention, doesn't it just lead to a case where if a conqueror is able to hold on to the territory for long enough, they've kind of acquired rights that they did not have before. So let's say, for instance, a case where for some reason, in 1948, the Arab armies were better organized or something, and they managed to inflict a crushing military defeat on the Haganah and so on. I mean, it seems in that case, occupancy rights are still uh, uh, solely held by the Palestinians, who had just, recently been removed or expelled. So somebody could wonder if we just say, post 67 or maybe up to today, 2024, we can now say that Jewish settlers have some sort of occupancy right. Doesn't that just lead to a justification of the ways of the conqueror, basically?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important not to give a perverse incentive to conquerors to create facts on the ground and to have prolonged occupancy, which in the course of time will eventually turn into an acquired right. So this is why, I mean, I think you have to build in those kinds of safeguards and say that, if prolonged occupancy is a result of a fairly recent dispossession or displacement, you have to find ways of accommodating the people who are dispossessed or displaced. I'm not sure I understand the case you're trying to describe, Ziad, because I mean, at that point, I think, yeah, if somehow the Haganah had not succeeded in ethnically cleansing and seizing most of the territory of Palestine in 1948, I, would imagine that even the Jewish immigrants who had gone there, who wanted to stay, would have been given citizenship rights in a state. I mean, the right thing to be done would be to give them citizenship rights in whatever state was established, but not to give them some kind of right to their own state or self-government or take over some part of it. Unless they really formed a substantial majority in that part where they could claim some kind of autonomy or self-government, maybe there would have been some argument for having a enclave around Tel Aviv that had some kind of self-government for Jews, and those Jews who wanted to stay in that region would have been able to. But I'm not sure if that addresses your question.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it was a slightly malformed question, but yes. Augie, do you want to jump in?
Before we move on, I just wanted to briefly highlight one thing that Muhammad Ali said that I think is worth emphasizing, that in discussions of territorial rights, I think, and part of these kind of debates I brought up earlier about the moral right, a lot of people say, well, the land was purchased, like some of the land was purchased outright or fairly in some sense from absentee landlords or whoever who were selling large amounts of land to Jewish settlers. But something you brought up was that you said, well, from a moral perspective, you might think people have some claim that goes beyond the ownership of the land. And one thing that struck me in reading about the history is that this period of massive Jewish settlement in the mid 20th century corresponded with the industrialization and industrialized agriculture, et cetera, in which the kind of feudal system of kind of, I guess, tenement, I don't know, like the farmers living on the land who didn't own the land, that there was kind of a transition away. And part of the nationalist project was to expel them, right, to replace them with Jewish agricultural laborers. So in some sense, they were legally evicted because the ownership changed. They no longer had a legal agreement with the owner, and they were asked to leave. And this is part of my understanding. This is part of what led to a lot of unrest and like under Mandate Palestine, even as that these displaced people were in the cities, underemployed, and didn't have access. And arguably they were wronged, right, for the reasons you gave, that there was a prolonged practice, a set of expectations, and they had a certain maybe they had, I mean, I don't know, a certain right to be there, or at least a right to some kind of better compensation for what happened. So I just want to maybe highlight that often arguments about private property, who owns it, who has a right to be there, legally speaking, but it doesn't take into account like long-standing practices and reasonable expectations and ways of life of the people who lived there and then were told to leave with no real other option to go to.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of very important points there. A right of a group to a territory does not reduce to the right of private property of individuals to plots of land, because I might own a plot of land here in suburban New York, and my neighbor is renting. But I don't think that when it comes to questions of self-government or the right of a group to reside in a territory, I should have somehow more right than my neighbor who's just a renter. The other thing is that you're right to point out also that the system in Ottoman Palestine was a very complex one, and Palestine. So there were villages where the villagers didn't own the plots of land around the village, but they had farmed it for generations, for hundreds of years. And it was owned, strictly speaking, by the state. It was state land, so it was owned by the Ottoman Empire. But effectively, the villagers had the right to it because they'd always farmed it. It's always been in their families. But what happened when Israel took over the land is they considered that land state land, and therefore the state appropriated it. And this is still happening, by the way, in the West Bank and Gaza, wherever there are not clear property and title deeds, and even often when there are, Israel is just able to seize the land and say, oh, this is state land, we're the state, therefore we have the land. But the villagers, I mean, these are my olive trees. I've been, my great grandparents were involved in planning and taking care of them and so on. So that's all been kind of, I think, ignored in these discussions, both of those points. And it's kind of interesting because I recently read an interview with a Palestinian theorist and thinker and activist, Elias Shufani, who's passed away, from the 1980s, where he's imagining a future Palestine. He said, look, the point is not to restore every plot of land to its original owner, because the situation was unjust in Palestine before 48. We don't want to go back to a situation of injustice where some people owned lots of land and other people didn't own any land at all. So the idea is to reimagine a Palestine where Arabs and Jews share the land without giving these huge disparities to some people over others. So, I mean, maybe if there's a house that's been in my family for generations and so on, I have important cultural ties to that house or to that particular village and so on. But to go back to the status quo ante is not the most just solution right now. Justice in the present doesn't always consist of turning the clock back to the situation that happened before the gross injustice that occurred historically.
Right, and I think this is really interesting because it touches also on some contemporary accounts of reparations or just general attempts to overturn historical injustices. So I'm thinking, for example, of Olufemi Taiwo's book on reparations, which is seen as a kind of forward-looking political project. And I think that's very salient, I think, in the writings of especially Palestinian leftists, of course, who definitely don't want to or don't envision going back to a kind of semi-feudal state, or however we wish to describe it. I don't think anybody thinks of that as an emancipatory project. And I mean, just also on the point of the absentee landowners. I mean, I know, for example, in Nablus, a lot of the big landowners who acquired their properties through serving as sepahis for the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman conquest of the region. And so yeah, it's not just also a question of legal rights and bracketing questions of justice and morality. So I think that's a really important point that we've been discussing. Should we kind of pivot to the second reading? Does that sound reasonable? Okay. So our second reading is, I mean, it's I don't know if Muhammad Ali, you would characterize this as a philosophical text. I mean, I like it. I don't really care if it's philosophical, or maybe it's literary criticism with a historicist bent. I don't know how you conceived of it. But maybe you can, if you can just tell us why you wrote this article on Theodor Herzl's Altneuland, his utopian novel, and what you were attempting to do in this piece.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a literary critic, and I don't think I've ever written anything quite like that, because it's a work that is focused primarily on a work of literature. But it's a work of literature that is obviously a very polemical work. It's an argumentative work. It's trying to put forward. I'm trying to say in this article that it's putting forward an argument. Like most works that are at least have the form of a utopia, the aim is not just to produce a work of literature, a work that edifies, but also a work of persuasion, I think. And so I guess I gave a kind of philosophical reading of it. I approached it as though it was an argument primarily. I mean, I should say, and I don't think this is just my opinion, I don't think the novel has that much literary merit. I mean, part of the paradox of Herzl, I think, was that he wrote, in addition to this novel, a number of plays, and he thought his real vocation lay in being a playwright. And his real ambition was to make it as a playwright. But I think there was general feeling among audiences and the people who received his work that he didn't have all that much talent as a literary figure. And it's kind of ironic that this is a man who had incredible skills as a politician and a political strategist, but who thought his real talents lay elsewhere, and who tried to but in this work, he tried to put whatever literary talents he had in the service of this political cause that he had embraced and had become very, very determined to pursue in his lifetime. And I think, he died long before the establishment of the State of Israel, but I think he, more than anyone else, and I think everyone agrees on this, Zionists and non-Zionists, was responsible for really making this kind of Zionist vision a reality.
Thank you very much for the overview. Augie, do you want to jump in with specific questions or comments?
Yeah, why don't we start with the general question of why you think it's important to engage with these early texts of the fathers of the Zionist movement?
I think one reason is that Zionism is very much alive and well in the policies, practices, laws, and general conduct of the Israeli state. I think it's a real unusual case of a 19th century ideology which survives more or less intact in the 21st century, in the laws, in the regulations, in the policies of a state. And it's not very common to see this kind of ideology, which really, I think, is outdated and doesn't really conform to the world as we know it and to our current thinking about democracy and liberalism and tolerance and general ideas of decolonization and egalitarianism and so on. And yet it very much governs and guides the current practices of the Israeli government. And I think also dominates the thinking of most Jewish Israelis. I think most Jewish Israelis would describe themselves as Zionists. And I think they still conform to that vision that Herzl and other early Zionist thinkers had. So I think it's kind of important, and it's, I think, revealing to look at the writings and the thinking of the early Zionists to understand how Israel conducts itself and its attitude towards the Palestinians and its policies and laws and so on.
Yeah, and on that note, I thought one really interesting element in the piece itself is the way you emphasize that in Herzl's account, we get basically, we don't get any account of how the population was displaced. So the protagonists of the novel, they come back and they see this basically a European society, what is essentially a European society, this kind of cosmopolitan, enlightened society. And maybe there are still a few Arabs kind of for decoration or for diversity purposes. But what's interesting is, I mean, this whole idea of a Zionist project leading to a kind of liberal cosmopolitan society only works if the original inhabitants disappear. If they're still there, well, then you have to implement things like arbitrary detention. You have to have laws that distinguish between Jews and non-Jews in relation to property ownership and so on. So there is this inherent, I think, contradiction or tension in the project as a whole. It only really, I mean, it can only really lead to a project that accords with the, at least in its legal structures and so on, that accords with Enlightenment ideals if you can make the inhabitants disappear overnight, literally cease to exist. But if they're still there, well, you can't really do that. So I thought that was a really interesting thing in the text.
Yeah, it's kind of like a magic wand that they wave. I mean, maybe I should say a couple of words if people haven't read the novel, but the basic idea is the premise of the novel is that there's a Jewish intellectual who's facing discrimination, who's not able to find a job, who's living in Vienna around the turn of the century. And in desperation, he answers an ad in the newspaper which says that there is a wealthy nobleman who needs a conversational partner, who wants a companion and is willing to pay them a salary. Now, the catch is that this wealthy nobleman, German guy, by the name of Kingscourt, wants to go to retire on an island in the South Pacific. He's fed up with European civilization. He wants to leave European civilization. So this entails this conversational companion accompanying him on a ship, on a yacht, to go to the South Pacific. And so he decides to do it because he's desperate and he has no prospects in Europe anymore. And on the way, this nobleman, Kingscourt, proposes to Löwenberg, the protagonist, who's really a stand-in for Herzl, let's pass by the Holy Land and go to the land of your ancestors. And Löwenberg's response is kind of interesting. He says, I have no ties to this place. Only an anti-Semite would consider this my homeland, which is very interesting and telling, and maybe we'll go back to that. So they go to this to Palestine around the turn of the century, and they find it a miserable place. You know, Herzl spent a few days in Palestine in his life. It's kind of ironic. He worked his whole life towards transforming Palestine into a Jewish state, but he only spent a few days in Palestine and apparently abhorred it. He thought that it was filthy. He couldn't stand the sight of the Arabs. It's a very Orientalist description. And it talks about how it's desolate, and there's a few Jewish settlers who are beginning to try and infiltrate and transform it, but it's basically a lost cause. So they go for 22 years, I think, to the South Pacific, and then they decide, oh, let's give Europe another chance. And on the way back, they say, let's pass by Palestine again. And now, 22 years later, it's been transformed into this modern, very westernized, very European Jewish state, where, as you say, the Arabs are just a token presence. But it's interesting that 20-year gap in the narrative, and most of the novel then proceeds to describe this Jewish state as this somewhat utopian kind of society. But the 20-year gap allows Herzl to sort of sweep under the rug the process of transformation. It's a very useful literary device. We'll just sort of turn a blind eye and we look again, and suddenly it's now been transformed. And one of the main things, although he doesn't harp on it, is the native inhabitants are just a tiny minority. They're there for color. He describes Haifa and he says there were Chinese and there were Persians and there were people of all nationalities, and yes, there were a few Arabs, right? How that came to be, we don't know. Now, we know from Herzl's diaries and other writings that he envisaged a plan for actually expelling the people, maybe compensating them, giving them land elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire, but somehow driving them out by incentives or by force. But the novel conveniently manages to hide that with this gap in the narrative.
Would you
One
like to
quick,
jump in? Go ahead.
yeah, just a quick follow-up thought is what this is kind of a random thought, but what struck me in thinking about this is almost how US history is taught. You learn about the Columbus arriving or the Pilgrims, and there are these Native Americans, and they have things, and then you kind of fast forward, and you're like, step into Seattle, Washington. It's a cosmopolitan city with rights, and there are some indigenous people around, and there's this, and the parallels with U.S. removal of indigenous people and the setting up of a modern state or European society, really, United States with Israel, I think is like interesting to think through. And of course, a lot of authors now have thought about parallels between indigenous people in the Americas and Palestinians and the struggle against colonialism. But I just thought it was interesting that in this, there is this kind of parallel with how the story of the United States is told. I mean, of course, we do learn some of the Trail of Tears or something, but it's usually kind of, skipped or not really emphasized that we went from contact to a modern society with rights and cosmopolitan values or whatever. So I just thought.
Yeah, I mean, of course, one of the main differences is in North America, the native population was largely exterminated. In Palestine, of course, many people were killed, are still being killed, and we're witnessing that on a daily basis. But the vast majority were expelled, and many of them and their descendants are still living in refugee camps in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, and so on. And many also left and went other places. But one other difference, the population that remained within what is the state of Israel without the occupied territories were given citizenship rights, very, third-class citizenship rights are, in fact, discrimination against them is in some ways increasing over time. But the people who are basically still, the vast majority of people who are still living under Israeli sovereignty are not being given the option of becoming citizens in the state. So, I mean, there are many, many problems with the status of Native Americans in the US, but they are citizens of the state. And in some ways, I mean, the most basic demand of Palestinians is to become citizens, right? And now you have this situation where you have basically 7.5 million Jews and 7.5 million Arabs, Palestinian Arabs, living in this territory between the river and the sea, which is under Israeli sovereignty. And I think one fundamental demand of Palestinians is that everyone be treated equally within that territory. And of course, this is where Zionism the real stumbling block to that is Zionist ideology. Zionism says that, and Netanyahu has been saying this more and more openly, I think, there is no room for self-determination of anyone but the Jewish people in the area between the river and the sea. So then the question is, okay, but what do you do with half the people living there? Okay, some have citizenship. There's about 2 million Palestinians who have citizenship, but then there's another 5.5 million. Are they going to be expelled? Are they going to be exterminated? Are they going to be relegated to this permanent disenfranchised state, which is apartheid-like? There's no clear answer. How long is this going to go on? But really, the stumbling block to this, to one person, one vote, to equal rights citizenship, is Zionism, is this ideology that says there needs to be a state that is exclusively for the Jewish people and privileges Jewish people and gives citizenship primarily to them.
Yeah, and on that point, because I think it's really important maybe for our listeners to emphasize there is something very peculiar about the state of Israel, which I mean, Israel doesn't have a constitution, but it has a set of basic laws. I believe that's what they call them. And explicitly there, I mean, Israel is not a state of its citizens; it's a state of the Jewish people, which is very peculiar when compared to other states. So again, there's a kind of workaround. Such that your access to property or something like that is not contingent on being a citizen, but on being Jewish, more specifically. So I think this is again this tension between how we conceive of the liberal democratic state and what happens when liberal democracy is supposed to accommodate itself to an ideology like Zionism is quite interesting, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we could talk about the Jewish National Fund and agencies like that who control most of the land of the State of Israel and controls it for the benefit of the Jewish people. And of course, anyone who claim or can show that they are Jewish, of Jewish descent, has automatic citizenship rights, whereas Palestinians who were born there, who have very strong historic ties don't have citizenship rights. So my father was born in Jerusalem. He can't go there and become a citizen in the way that anyone who, any person who can establish that they're Jewish or of Jewish descent can go and become a citizen.
Avi, do you have a follow-up or a comment? So, I mean, one thing I wanted to ask you about, which I thought was very interesting, and this circles back to part of the earlier discussion as well. But I mean, my impression, based on your reading your article, is in some ways Herzl took it for granted that anti-Semitism in Europe is somehow or other ineradicable. So it's a kind of very pessimistic view. And therefore, the solution is this kind of separatist movement, which manifests itself in a settler colony. And so there is this really interesting, I think, relationship between a certain attitude towards anti-Semitism and Zionism. Because the idea is, well, Jews cannot be safe anywhere in Europe. Not now, not in the foreseeable future. So it's really a kind of sealing off of this avenue. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts on that. I think you're absolutely right. I think that the mainstream of the Zionist movement, Zionism is in some ways, I think, premised on the inevitability of anti-Semitism and the ineradicability of anti-Semitism. And I think that's a deeply pessimistic kind of attitude. And I think we see it today. I mean, Joe Biden, President of the United States currently, made a statement, said this a couple of times, I think, in just the past few months, that without the state of Israel, no Jew would be safe anywhere in the world, which is a very, very striking admission for the President of the United States to be saying, because he has many Jewish citizens, and he's saying that the United States can't protect its own Jewish citizens, and that we need the state of Israel to protect them. And it just, I think, as I said, I think it's deeply pessimistic, and it gives in to anti-Semitism and racism in a way that we should never give in to racism. So I think that's one thing. I think, and it was very much on Herzl's mind. And Herzl has passages in his diaries where he says, anti-Semitists will be our most dependable friends, and anti-Semitic states will be our allies. And I think that that outlook has also to this, there's a kind of a through line to current day Zionists. And I think the reason that someone like Biden makes a statement like that is that it's still a central tenet of Zionism. And I think that this comes out very much in the novel, because in many ways, I try to argue in my article that the novel is an argument made primarily to non-Jews, and specifically, I would say, to anti-Semites, that the existence of a Jewish state would benefit them. And the central character, Kingscourt, Löwenberg, the Jewish protagonist, who's a stand-in for Herzl, he alludes to the fact that he's anti-Semitic in his attitudes. He's the person who is being told or being convinced of the justice and the benefit of having a Jewish state. So, and even his name, King's Court, he's sitting, he's kind of a member of a tribunal who's judging this new society. And so every explanation, every description of this Jewish state is made primarily to King's Court, who's sitting in judgment on this society. So I think it's an indication of the fact that for Herzl, he thought his primary audience in many ways was not so much fellow Jews, but the anti-Semites who he wanted to convince of the benefit of having a state for the Jews. And of course, you know, there's a clear kind of confluence of between the aims of Zionism and the aims of anti-Semites, because anti-Semites want to get rid of Jews. They want Jews not to live in their societies in Western Europe and in other parts of the world. And so if Jews decide to go elsewhere, that's very much in accordance with their aims and desires.
Yeah, that's great. Augie, any thoughts or comments?
Nope. Do you want to move on to, I could ask another question. How about one question we were thinking of is, how do thinkers like Herzl conceive of the relationship between Zionism and Jewish diasporic history?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I'm really best qualified to talk about that. I mean, I think that for Herzl was very secular. He was very assimilated. He was not really a practicing Jew. And I think he saw Jewish history and the allure of Palestine and the appeal of Palestine to many Jews who were more steeped in tradition, who are more practicing, was very important and instrumental in achieving his Zionist ambition. So, you know, even though he considered other places to set up a Jewish society, ultimately he and many other Zionists decided that the significance of Palestine and Jerusalem to Jews who were more practicing and traditional was greater than the significance of any. And if they wanted mass migration of Jewish people, Palestine had the kind of cultural significance to Jews that no other place in the world had. So I think for him, it was largely kind of instrumental. And I should mention, I mean, he never comes out and says it, but I think Herzl thought that there was maybe the possibility for some more assimilated Jews to remain in Western societies. I mean, he thought of himself as being very much German in his culture and German in his outlook. And I think he might have thought that if there was a mass migration of Jews out of Europe and elsewhere to Palestine, there could be a minority of Jews who stayed behind who wouldn't experience the same level of discrimination and racism because there weren't large numbers, large communities of Jewish people living in Western Europe. And this is a bit speculative, but I mean, it comes out a bit in the novel because the novel starts by describing this migration of Jewish people from Eastern Europe and Russia to Central and Western Europe due to pogroms and, you know, campaigns against Jews and so on. And these were Jews who were not as assimilated. They were more traditional. They tended to be poorer and less educated. And they were feeling, I mean, they were giving rise to a surge of anti-Semitism in the late 19th century and the turn of the century. I mean, they were giving rise, obviously unjustifiably, but I think in Herzl's mind, there was a causal link between the migration of Jews as a result of terrible persecution in Eastern Europe and in Russia. And that was leading to a backlash, even against assimilated Jews like him, who, you know, could easily pass and were much more integrated into Central and Western European societies. So there was a kind of an anxiety about this migration. I think he saw Zionism partly as a solution for the vast majority of Jews who did not have the same kind of facility in certain Western societies as he did.
Okay, excellent. Maybe we can try to wrap up by posing perhaps a concluding question. So I'm thinking one question that could be posed by a sympathetic skeptic would say, well, we're doing all of this stuff and we're engaging in normative moral arguments, but it's not implausible for somebody to say, well, look, given the history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, or however we wish to describe it, it's simply the case that normative arguments or moral arguments don't seem to have much causal potency. So maybe somebody skeptical about a kind of normative philosophical approach to these issues would say, well, it seems that force decides in the end. And I was wondering, how could we respond to such a person? What kind of evidence we would bring to bear that maybe they're not quite correct?
I mean, I think the current situation that we're in, which a lot of people, an increasing number of people in the world find completely morally outrageous. And we've seen this very strong mass movement in many parts of the world, and not just in the West, but in the global South and elsewhere, mobilization among students, among workers, unions, groups, environmental groups, and so on, against what's going on in Gaza today. And I think they're motivated by a sense of moral outrage. And I think that philosophical and moral arguments can only strengthen that movement. And I think it needs to be, I mean, to go back, to circle around back to Augie's initial question, moral philosophy is needed to sustain these kinds of movements, and ethical thinking and thinking about what justice demands is necessary to give these movements their sustenance, and to give these movements life, and to ensure that they carry on. So I think that it's really a kind of essential part of any kind of mass movement to have reasoned arguments that are ultimately, the motivation and the sustenance for such movements. And I think we're witnessing a big change, a huge change. It's a change. I mean, someone, who came to the West some 40 years ago, I think there's been a huge transformation, and I think that I'm optimistic that that's not going to let things go on business as usual in Palestine.
Good. That's, I think, a good note to end on.